Thank you very kindly, Dr. Davis. We expect great things from that program in the next little while. It's a great pleasure for me now to be able to introduce you Dr. Maurica Maher as the Associate Director of the Office of Legislative Regulatory Modernization of Health Canada. And she has worked in a number of areas for drug evaluation, but since 2006 has been the co-leader of the initiative to modernize Canada's regulatory framework for pharmaceutical and biologics that will develop and adopt a life cycle approach to the regulation of drugs. And we hope to work very closely with Health Canada, and thank Dr. Maher for being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present. I'm a medical scientific person by training, and although I've been working in this policy development area for some time now, I'm always excited when I get to hopefully bring the policy and the regulatory work to the scientific community. So I hope that my presentation, I can make it relevant to you and your work, and you can understand how we take the information that comes out of the work that scientists and physicians and other healthcare professionals do, and how we try and incorporate it into our assessment of therapeutic products so that we can get good, solid information out there to healthcare professionals and patients, because helping them make informed decisions is a huge objective of ours. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current regulatory system. I know that there are some people here who are familiar with it, but I'm sure there are some people here who are not all that familiar with it. I certainly wasn't before I got into this line of work. This life cycle approach that we talk about, how we came to this idea and why we think it's important, and where we want to go with it. I'm going to briefly mention the Food and Consumer Safety Action Plan in the former Bill C-51, which was an amendment was a bill to amend the Food and Drugs Act, and then talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities for Canada, our fellow regulators, and here and there throughout the presentation I will try and link it to issues around not just pregnancy and lactation, but other populations that have been traditionally neglected somewhat in development processes. My background actually is I started in the medical world as a pediatric resident, so some of this is quite near and dear to my heart as well. So in terms of regulating drugs and other therapeutic products in Canada, our main legislative instrument, the law that governs what we do, is called the Food and Drugs Act. It's quite old. It originally came in the early 1900s. And it covers a wide variety of products: foods, drugs, devices, cosmetics. Cells, tissues, and organs for transplantation as well fall under the definition of drug because it's quite broad. So through the Act and the regulations that we get the mandate to regulate these products. So if you want to market one of these products in Canada, you have to come to us and get it cleared by us. Otherwise, you're on the market illegally. The original focus was preventing adulteration of products. So that's stuff in your products that you don't want to be there, whether it's by accident or there deliberately. So things like strychnine or cyanide, those sorts of things. Manufacture in unsanitary conditions, because that was a real problem in the early 20th century. And fraudulent labels and advertising. So this goes back to the old sort of snake oils and what were called patent medicines back in the early 1900s. The last significant revisions to the drug regulations were actually done in the 50s and 60s, and it was around the time of thalidomide. So there hasn't been a wholesale comprehensive review of the regulations that govern the marketing of pharmaceuticals and biologics in the country since that time. So that's a long time. We have very few abilities with respect to the post-market period, and that's of great interest, I'm sure, to the people here. For example, we don't have the ability to require a company make a label change to a product. We don't have the ability to say, you will recall this product and this is how you will do it. We don't have the ability to say, we've identified a potential problem with your product and we want you to give us your information that you have on it or do another study. These are all abilities that we don't have right now. So we use moral suasion. And often it works, but it's time-consuming, resource-intensive, and in the meantime, the information isn't getting out as rapidly as it should be to the people that need to use it. So when we were first developing our project, we started thinking about it. We started thinking about the products having a life cycle. So they have an origin, they go through their life, they mature, then they eventually come off the market for a number of reasons. Sometimes they become obsolete, sometimes it's realized that the benefit-risk profile is no longer positive for this product because of new information. So lots of reasons that products come up. But the knowledge that we gain throughout that product's existence helps with the next product or with the continuation of that one for another use. So this diagram, the inner circle represents the life cycle of the product itself going through those various phases. Those sort of bars that are not attached to each other on the periphery of the diagram indicate where we as Health Canada have an actual regulatory mandate about what's going on with the product. So the red part represents clinical trial review. If you want to do a clinical trial in Canada, you have to come to us and get your clinical trial reviewed and get a non-objection letter. If you want to market your product in Canada, you have to submit a product submission to us and we review it, and that's kind of the indigo or purpley blue bar. And then the greenish bar on the other side there, that represents the submission of adverse drug reactions. And that you can see that none of these bars are sort of connected to each other, and information doesn't easily flow from one to the other. And there's not a holistic or a big picture approach here because the system is old and because it hasn't been comprehensively reviewed for a long time. So, drivers for change. I don't think I'm going to be surprising anybody with this information here. The recognition of the limitations of pre-market data sets. We have very frequently huge groups of patients who are excluded from clinical trials because of inclusion-exclusion criteria, but that are likely candidates to receive the product once it's out on the market. We have a lack of investigations in certain populations, children, the elderly, pregnant and lactating women. Pre-market investigations are very poor for detecting uncommon or rare adverse events, and they're rare when you've got a data set of maybe 2,000 patients, but once it makes it again out into the general market, that is when we start to see the uncommon or the adverse events coming to the fore. And they're still rare in terms of their frequency of occurrence, but they can be very significant in terms of their severity, and they can make the risk-benefit profile undesirable or frankly negative for some products. And this is how a number of products have ended up being withdrawn from the market. One example is valdecoxib, which was one of the coxibs that didn't get pulled off the market because of its cardiovascular events. Excuse me, I'm getting a cold. But because of Stevens-Johnson syndrome and severe skin reactions. And that was different from the other coxibs. And so although the incidence overall was quite low, it made the product unacceptable from a wholesale point of view. And we have, of course, during the pre-market period, we're not collecting real-world safety and effectiveness data, just efficacy and safety. There are severe limitations on passive surveillance activities to detect and verify risks. And we've had a number, valdecoxib is one, Vioxx is another one, Baycol is another one, Cerevastatin, high-profile drug withdrawals for safety concerns. So there's been a number of things that have happened over the past decade that have refocused the attention back to the safety of products. We've seen a lot of modernization efforts in other regulatory jurisdictions, and some of them with respect to drug use in pregnancy and lactation, Dr. Davis referred to earlier, and not just in that area, but overall with respect to the regulation of therapeutic products, particularly in the United States and the EMEA, and I'll refer a little bit to that as I go on. there's increased scrutiny of regulatory activities and a desire for openness and transparency. And both the EMEA and the United States have recently issued concept papers or consultation papers on their policies for openness and transparency. This is an issue that we struggle with too as well, with respect to how much data do you put out in the public domain at what point, and what kind of guidance do you give people for interpreting that data. And this relates to the comment that the other Dr. Davis made in his presentation earlier, because how responsible really is it to dump a lot of data out there and not give people guidance on what it means or how to interpret? You can actually do more harm than good by frightening people unnecessarily. The pattern of disease and product use has changed. Canadians are living longer with chronic conditions. We have some demographic data that indicates that 1 in 5, I think it is, Canadians self-identify as having a chronic disease. This includes children. Cystic fibrosis is a disease in which we've seen huge changes in the quality and the lifespan of children who are diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, but they take products for a long period of time and multiple types of products. In Canada, we have highly educated patient and consumer groups who want to be informed and involved. They want to know how they can get access to new and promising therapies. What we're seeing right now with the whole movement around the procedure for multiple sclerosis, the vascular procedure for multiple sclerosis, if that was a drug for multiple sclerosis, it'd be my office that'd be getting a lot of phone calls right now. Healthcare practice has evolved. The patient-professional partnership has changed. I think this is particularly evident in the pregnancy world, where my friends personally, my sister, when she was going through the childbearing phases of her, man, they want to know everything, and they want to be involved in making those decisions. Our role as a regulator has changed. We are seen as having much more responsibility than just being a gatekeeper, but we're also an information provider. And again, I think when I was a medical student as well, I made a number of assumptions about what Health Canada did, what the regulator did and didn't do, what they had the power to do, what they didn't have the power to do. One of the reasons that I got involved in this modernization project was that when I came to Health Canada, I was absolutely shocked when I was told, well, we can't really make them change their label. It's like, what do you mean we can't make them change their label? We're Health Canada. Well, we don't have the legal framework. And I'm like, well, I don't care. It's the right thing to do. But I was coming at it from my medical perspective and not a legal perspective. So I had a lot to learn. The Institute of Medicine report that came out post-Vioxx had, of course, a huge impact on activities both within the United States and without. The Food and Drug Administration Amendment Act of September 2007 gave the FDA a lot more abilities in the post-market environment. And these are things that we've been studying the evolution of them since 2007 to see what is appropriate to adopt in a Canadian context and what would work for us. That also goes for developments in the European Union. The European Union is probably at the forefront of regulatory development in this area. And they had new pharmaceutical legislation for pre-market, post-market, everything introduced in 2004. And then in 2006, 2007, they did a wide consultation on their pharmacovigilance or post-market abilities, and then proposed a number of changes to that would strengthen their abilities around communication of information, requiring post-market studies, a number of aspects. So in terms of our project, the goal of our project is to develop a modern legislative and regulatory framework that will support access to new therapies, so not having barriers where you don't need any, the continuous monitoring, assessment, and communication of product information that includes benefits and risks throughout the product life cycle, and that supports the optimal use of products to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. And this goes to, the right product for the right patient at the right time, whether you're pregnant or not. The primary objectives of the framework itself are, and this was developed after some early consultations with multi-participant stakeholder groups, to protect the public from the marketing of products that are just frankly unsafe, which is why we got into this business in the first place, but also to support the safest and optimal use of health products. Our supporting objectives are to better align our regulatory framework with the system, and that should be systems of healthcare in Canada, because we really have 13 systems and not one system. One of the things we also sort of realized as we started doing this project was that when the legislation that governs what we do came into being, there was no publicly funded healthcare system in Canada. And so when sometimes people are wondering, well, why don't these things link together and how come they don't make sense? Well, they were never designed to. And they sort of grew up in isolation from each other, often in a reactive way to meet an immediate need, and there was no overall approach at that time. So we want to implement best international regulatory practices where possible, and encourage and make use of evolutions in the science of drug development and regulation. So, for example, incorporating pharmacogenomic information, which is becoming the whole progression of personalized medicine is something that we are trying to incorporate, as well as other developments moving forward. So where are the first sort of cartoon that I showed had those, on the outside of the circle had those sort of split up bars. Now the bars are sort of all attached. So the idea is that the information continues to develop and that we have the ability to incorporate that information and make the best use of it throughout the life cycle of the product. So this slide sort of just reiterates some of that. But things like drug-drug interactions, I mean, these are things that if a new drug comes into the marketplace, well, then how's it going to interact with products that are already out there? Well, that's not something that you can always identify during the pre-market period, for example. The life cycle approach, we hope, will recognize the limitations of pre-market evaluation, and that without a systematic approach, and this is really key, that valuable information is lost. Because every time somebody is exposed or takes a product, information is generated. They either responded positively or they didn't. They had an adverse reaction or they didn't. They stopped taking it for whatever reason or they didn't. There's always information that is generated. And right now we have a system that information is continually lost. So how can we improve that? And the idea that the benefit-risk profile of the product should be evaluated throughout its life cycle. But you need good systematic data collection to facilitate that. Oops. So, whoa. What happened here? Where am I? Oops. Okay. I'm just gonna, we got a delay on this system, I think, here. Oh dear. I think I have a corrupt file. But that's okay. The couple of slides there that are missing, they basically just go individually through these sort of colored boxes on the outside of the circle. So I'll just talk about some of them. So in terms of the beginning, at clinical trial review, right now, we're not like the United States in that our clinical trial review system isn't linked as tightly to the ultimate marketing of the product. In the United States, the application for an investigational new drug is closely tied to the new drug application itself. So we would like to adopt a more of that kind of an approach so that the people who are reviewing the new drug will have easier access to whatever clinical trial information we had at the front end. Right now, it's just that our data sets are not linked. So we would like to facilitate that for our reviewers. And also, we're promoting the idea of these pre-submission meetings in which not only the people who review the clinical trials come in, but also the people who are ultimately going to be doing the new drug evaluations. And we're also engaged right now in a little bit of reorganization in my branch to see if we can't link those people more closely together so that they can share information. But the pre-submission meetings are really key in terms of bringing in industry so that they understand what our expectations are, both at the clinical trial stage, but also when you come to submit your product for approval. At the drug submission stage, the sort of colored box on the bottom talks to the authorization. And right now we have sort of one size fits all type of authorization. And what we would like to do is have the ability to put terms and conditions on an authorization. So if we identify a population like pregnant and lactating women who should be followed after authorization, we can put that as a term and condition on the product approval itself. And that way, under the regulatory system, the company will be required by law to do that work and bring back the results to us, so then we can see, does this change the benefit risk profile of the product? Is there new information that should be included in a product label? Are there risk mitigation activities that need to happen around this product? Ongoing reporting, the next box over. Right now, we just sort of have this blanket requirement to submit ADRs, but again, those depend as well on passive or spontaneous reporting by healthcare professionals or patients to manufacturers, which then come to us. We would like to have the ability to require different types of reporting if necessary, so active surveillance studies, drug utilization studies if necessary, so we can identify, is there a lot of off-label use happening with this product? How do we determine that? Right now, we don't have the ability to require that industry undertake that type of work. And then finally, the last box there represents reevaluation. So in certain instances, we would have the ability to require that the company come back with a complete reevaluation of the product. So the anticipated changes in this new framework are that this life cycle approach, which we kind of have implicitly in our system now, becomes explicit. And the benefit of having a regulatory structure is that it makes clear what the expectations are for both industry and us, because the amount of resources and time that goes into trying to address some of these complex issues can be quite significant, particularly in the absence of a firm regulatory footing that says, you know, according to regulation XYZ, you must do this. The formal incorporation of a benefit risk assessment or a benefit risk profile as the threshold for when we will approve a product or not. The ability to authorize with post-market commitments, as I said. More options for regulation in the post-market period. I mean, we do have, of course, the ability to remove a product's authorization if necessary, but that's a really blunt instrument to use. And one of the hardest, I guess, or the most difficult experiences I've had working at Health Canada is when we get this question, well, should we take it off? And we always know that somewhere in the country there is somebody for whom the benefit risk profile of this product is still positive. But we have a limited number of tools to ensure that people that shouldn't get exposed don't get exposed. So how can we do that better? That's one of the objectives of our framework. An increased emphasis on product information with respect to labels and product monographs, package leaflets, those sorts of things. Some of those regulations are quite old as well. And again, an increased emphasis on the evaluation of activities and evaluation of the regulatory framework. One of the things we're not really good at doing is evaluating the outcomes of what it is that we do. So if we do a label change, what is the best way to communicate that to healthcare professionals, the general public, and how do we measure the impacts of those label changes? And how can we then, if we're not getting the uptake or the information retention that we need, how do we make that better? So as I get close to the end here, I'll just talk a little bit about Bill C-51. So in 2008, this bill was introduced into the House of Commons, and it was a bill to amend the Food and Drugs Act and incorporate many of the things that I've talked about here. Unfortunately, when the Parliament was dissolved in 2008, the bill died on the order paper. But the intent of the government is still to reintroduce this legislation. The reasons for modernization haven't changed, and as the other jurisdictions move forward with their progress, it just becomes more and more important that we proceed. And there was a recommitment in the 2010 speech from the throne, I think at the beginning of March, that it was the government's intent to proceed with this legislation. So we were all, in my group, we were all very happy to see that recommitment stated once more. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, drug development is a global enterprise, which we constantly hear from our industry stakeholders. But sometimes regulators need data relevant to their populations. For example, in Canada, First Nations and Inuit people may respond differently to therapies. For example, if somebody was to come along and say, you know what, we have, now I'm dreaming here, you know, but one can hope, I have a great new therapy for tuberculosis. It would be really important to know how First Nations and Inuit people in Canada, if they were going to have any type of different response to that therapy or a different adverse event profile. That's just an example. Post-market data is especially important for chronic use drugs, so products for chronic diseases, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, so many different types of cancers, HIV. There are so many products for which we don't have a lot of really good chronic use data. This would give us the opportunity to maybe get more of that. Again, addressing special populations, either through planning early during the drug development stage to recruit such patients or identify such patients, to plan ahead for special subgroup analysis. There are some things that we can do better at the pre-market stage. It doesn't always translate particularly to the pregnant and lactating population, but for some of the others it does. But if you never even think about them to begin with, then at the other end you're going, oh, why didn't somebody think of doing a subgroup analysis? Especially for women and the inclusion of women in clinical trials. It's very important. Can we better approximate real-world use in some way? Looking at concomitant drug use and comorbidity. Early interaction with us is critical. And again, you know, we want to continue the work that we've begun with stakeholders. One of the real successes of this project has been the involvement of stakeholder groups and how much they appreciated being included early in our development process. Traditionally, what government has done is it's gone out, it's identified an issue, it's worked up a regulatory proposal, and then it goes out and it tries to encourage uptake in the communities. And we sort of adopted a different type of approach where we went out really early and said, well, before we go away and come up with a bunch of language that then we want you to look at, tell us what's important to you. Tell us what's missing. Tell us what you'd like to see. Be a partner with us. And that's been extraordinarily successful. Evaluation. Evaluation is always my hobby horse because my team is tired of me saying, what is your objective that you're trying to achieve and how are you going to measure it to see if you did it? So what are appropriate outcome measures for clinical trials and other types of studies? What can we learn from professionals and patients about what's a valid outcome measure for you? What, you know, and there's, you know, it's the debate between statistical and clinical significance. How can we learn from what other regulators have done in this area? And again, planning for evaluation of the framework itself to determine if the framework has met its objectives, the ones that I mentioned earlier. So I'd like to finish off with this slide that I'm quite fond of. It's an old slide. It's from JAMA from 1954. But having had the experience that I had with working on Vioxx and the other coxibs, it really spoke to me. So at the beginning, somebody gets really excited about a development idea. It's wonderful. It cures everything. Everybody's using it. It's great. And then there's a problem. In the slide, it's agranulocytosis. It's like, oh my God, nobody should ever use this drug. It's a poison. And then you get the plateau where people realize that for some people, with the appropriate diagnosis and at the appropriate time and everything else, it's the best therapy. And I think what we would like to support in our project, in our regulatory scheme, is getting from that beginning to that plateau without those big peaks. because then you have either undertreatment or overtreatment or people being exposed who really shouldn't be exposed. And I think that's our goal, is to try and to do better. So thank you very much for your attention. And
Dr. Maher, thank you very much. That's a refreshing presentation from the government. I really appreciate your enthusiasm.
thank you.
So these things you talked about, I think everybody in the room would agree these are great things. And I see you going forward, but I see a big hurdle, two big hurdles. And to get all this information, everything, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost industry lots of money to do this. So I just want your comments on that. And the other thing is political will. Now, you mentioned the bill, C-51, and that's somewhere right now. So I wonder if there's anything that organizations across the country can do with regard to maybe our MPs or our Minister of Health or something to put that in the forefront. Thank you.
Well, those are great questions. Thank you. First of all, with respect to resources, absolutely. One of, I guess, the advantages of doing this after everybody else is that we get to piggyback on what the Europeans and the Americans are doing. And they already have set out a number of these types of requirements for industry. So industry is already producing some of this information. So, you know, having had them sort of, I guess, pave the way makes it easier for us. And industry has actually been fairly accepting of a number of these proposals. One of the things there have been concerns raised about is the ability to require tests and studies. So to ensure that to answer every sort of outstanding question, we don't go, you know, sort of go off to an extreme as the regulator and ask for a full-blown RCT for everything. Well, we know that we don't need a full-blown RCT to answer every single question, and that would actually delay the compilation of important information. So what will come down from the legislation itself we will have to develop a set of regulations, and we will do that in consultation with various stakeholders. That's a requirement of developing regulations in Canada. And we will have to do a full cost-benefit assessment for every one of those regulations. And we've already been working with Treasury Board and other people to validate a method for our cost-benefit analysis. So that's the first part of that. In terms of what organizations can do to support this or promote this, the more this stays at the forefront for the minister and the deputy minister of our department, the more that helps us, because that demonstrates to them that there's still interest in the community, that people care about this issue, and that they want it to move forward. Every now and then we, you know, since we've been, since the speech from the throne, we get these requests to say, put together all the letters of support or all the emails, all the talks that you've been invited to speak at, so that we can present that evidence to them. And it does make a difference, and they do listen. So thank you for that question.
Yes, I'm happy to hear that you got this going on. I just sort of ask you, is included in this project you're talking about, are you going to discuss like update Health Canada advisories? And I have to say, this is a big thing for me, because you probably realize already one of my main research interests is antidepressants in pregnancy, and I have to say it's a little bit disappointing that if you go to the website of Health Canada, the last update was in 2005, and we're now 2010, and you know, and the advisories was based on unpublished studies, abstracts presented at meetings, and I mean, this is just my field, but I actually even went to a meeting in Ottawa about this, and I can't say anything's ever really come of that meeting, but I was just interested to know if this is going to be, because these are things that I know they're really for healthcare professionals, but I know a lot of patients read them, and it's a bit scary. So can you address that?
That's a fabulous question, because one of the things I didn't talk about in this presentation, because I was trying to keep it general and high level and not get too far down to the details or the weeds, but one of the specific proposals we had in our bill that we've got that came out of consultations with groups, and that we would certainly retain, and we got a lot of positive feedback on it when we tabled the bill the first time around, was a requirement for us to establish a register, not a registry, but a register of therapeutic product information. The Europeans have something similar to this. And on that register, the idea is that the register would be a portal or a site where people could go to find accurate, unbiased information on products. And it would have the product monograph, it would have the basis for approval, it would have any risk communication items that have gone out about that product, any changes to the terms or conditions on the product, any changes to labeling. So all of the information about the product would be in one place, and you would have information that would be directed for healthcare professionals and patients. Of course, this is a lovely idea, and one of the key elements to this would be promoting it and getting uptake in the community and making people aware of it. Because I think one of the problems with web-based information is that it's quite passive. And unless people know that it exists, they don't even know where to go to look. So
Many people aren't even aware that you have product monographs. That really shocked me.
I know.
Healthcare professionals about Health Canada product monographs.
Yep, I was one of them. Thank you.
Just like your comments on a case, Cisapride, I don't know if you remember Cisapride, but Cisapride's an interesting example to think about.
Yes.
It's a drug that I think in the right patient at the right time was a wonderful thing. And the problem was that it was being used inappropriately. There were label changes. And each time a label change came out, there's actually data from the U.S., I think, as opposed to Canada. But in the U.S., each time a label change came out, the drug was used more inappropriately. So physicians, when they were faced with the information about this, actually started to prescribe more poorly. Mm-hmm. And the drug kind of spiraled down and eventually had to be taken off the market because we couldn't prescribe it appropriately. So, in your framework, I don't see any kind of feedback or control on the individual prescribers. And I wonder what you think about the idea that there ought to be a tie-in at least to maybe the colleges in each province, so that if poor prescribers are identified, there's some way that they can be restricted.
I do remember Cisapride. My director, David Lee, remembers Cisapride very, very well because he was quite involved with the activities that were taken around Cisapride. Cisapride is a good example, like you say, of a product that has a place in the armamentarium. And the issue with Cisapride was that we couldn't risk manage it properly. I don't pretend to be a worldwide expert in risk management here, but I do know that evaluating your risk management activities or plans, whatever it is you do, is necessary both to make sure that you are achieving your objective, and if you're not, then you need to do something else. And this is something that is built into the authorization piece. Now, when it comes to identifying poor prescribers at the provincial level, this is one of these federal provincial division of responsibility things, and I don't want to say, oh, it's the province's fault and they should take care of it. But we have always been one of the things that we've tried to do in this project is discuss issues like that with the provinces and territories and say, okay, given that technically you are responsible for this and we are responsible for that, how do we work together so that in our different responsibilities we can support each other? And how can we work together to, again, achieve the objectives that we're trying to achieve? And if we're not getting there, then what should we be doing differently? And working with healthcare professional associations across the country is another way of doing that. And using them to communicate information to their members about how to use products appropriately, or if something's changed about a product, how do we work with them so that You know, we don't just have one source of information, but we have kind of like a web of information. So we have a number of nodes or points so that we can get that information to the right people who need to use it. Because I mean, Vioxx is another one. I mean, when we had our scientific and our public meeting about Vioxx and about all the coccibs, you know, several years ago, one of the things we heard was that, well, okay, Vioxx is gone now. Celebrex did nothing for me, so now it's methotrexate. Thanks. You know. And I mean, that's not the outcome that anybody wants. I mean, we had so many people who said that with this product, I could hold down a job, I could get out of bed, I had a decent quality of life. Now I don't. And we don't want to have to make those kinds of decisions. I mean, we can do better than that.
Last quick question.
Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Just sort of a little add-on to that question. You talked about the output of information using the colleges. What about the input of information to Health Canada before warnings go out or before? Do you have any plans in terms of how to incorporate those societies? For example, with the antidepressant warning, there's a large body of researchers and clinicians dealing with both depression as psychiatrists as well as obstetricians, fetal toxicologists, and a lot of which are in this room. But that the information from Health Canada seemed independent of this large body of knowledge external to Health Canada. Is there any thoughts on, in the new system, how to get input from the people on the ground prior to issuing decisions or warnings?
That's another great question. We do have some mechanisms now through which we reach out to healthcare professionals and in the scientific community. One is through certain expert advisory panels that we have. We have a couple of great committees up and going now. One is our expert panel on vigilance of health products. Another one is our Pediatric Expert Advisory Committee. We also, from time to time, convene specific scientific advisory panels to answer specific types of questions. The legislation proposed an ability to create committees and be able to remunerate people appropriately, which would be a big advantage for us. Because without that, we can't really remunerate people, and that leads to all kinds of difficulties because it's, you know, people are busy, they've got clinics, they've got labs to run. If you're going to ask them to give you their expertise and their time, it's much easier to recruit people for a year or a couple of years to be on a committee if they know it's going to be stable and there's going to be some funding attached to it. In terms of, so we've been expanding our ability to work with the outside communities, I think, more and more over time, but there are some things in the legislation that will certainly support us in doing that. And also issuing communications and getting information out is another thing that that is actually referred to explicitly in the legislation. Thank you very much, everybody, for your interest in this. I'm really happy with the questions, and it's great.